Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone and welcome back once again to this lecture series on aluminium based alloys and metal matrix composites. Okay, so right now we are talking about processing of MMCs. And in the previous class, we have seen that depending on the state of the matrix material during processing, the processing routes can be classified into three broad categories. That is solid state processing, liquid state processing, and vapor state processing. And the different processing routes in each of these categories we have already discussed. Such as star casting and melt infiltration in liquid metallurgy route, in solid state we have powder metallurgy, diffusion bonding, and high energy high rate process. And in the vapor state processing, we basically have the vapor deposition processes such as PVD, CVD, etc. Now, apart from these three main states of the matrix material in which it can be processed, the MMCs can also be processed in the two-phase region. Where both liquid and solid coexist. So in this class, we are going to talk about some of these methods of two-phase processing of metal matrix composites. We have already seen the spray deposition process as part of the liquid metallurgy route, and in that process the liquid metal is broken down into a stream, and into that stream the reinforcement phase is introduced, and when these two get mixed up they solidify on a substrate inside the spray chamber, and when it is solidified a composite is formed. Okay, so that happens all in the liquid state. I mean particularly the mixing of the metal and the reinforcement that occurs in the liquid state itself. So therefore into this stream of the molten metal the reinforcement particles are added at a location when these metal droplets are still in the liquid condition, right? So therefore a variation of this could be to have these particles added at a location of the stream where it will be in the two-phase region, in the two-phase condition. Okay. So partial solidification has taken place, let's say down the stream, somewhere little away from this nozzle where you have an atomizer. You may have these metal droplets in the two-phase state. So now this particle addition can be done by choosing a location like this and adding the particles into that particular location, into this spray chamber. Okay, so this is a process known as variable co-deposition of multi-phase materials. Or VCM in short. Right, so here also at the end of the spray chamber you have a substrate on which this mixture of the reinforcement and the metal will be deposited in the form of a composite. Here one of the main process parameters that will control the volume fraction of the particulates which are added to the metal is the angle of injection, which has a significant influence on the distribution of the particles. And also the volume fraction of particles. Injection angle is nothing but the angle of this particle delivery tube that you have with the axis of this chamber. Okay, so that will have a bearing on the volume fraction of particles as well as on the distribution of the particles in the composite. So with the help of this one single parameter, it is possible to exercise a great deal of control on this process in terms of the amount or the volume fraction of particles that can be added in a particular composite. So this was about VCM process. Now the star casting technique that we discussed before, it also has a variant in the sense that this stirring of the melt which was done in the primary star casting process, that can be done when the metal is in the two-phase region. Okay, so instead of stirring it in the liquid state, it can be also stirred in the two-phase condition. Okay, so the metal can be melted first and then the temperature can be brought down so that the metal goes into a mushy state. When some fraction of solid is also present. Okay, so now if you rotate this impeller in the messy state, you can create agitation into this two-phase material, and then the particles can be added like how it was done during the stir casting process. The main advantage in this case is the fact that you already have some fraction of solid present even before the stirring is done, right? So when the particles are added, these particles will be mechanically entrapped and will be prevented from agglomeration. Okay, so you can expect a better particle distribution in this case due to the presence of the solid when the particles are added into this two-phase material. Okay, so as the particles are added, the solid ceramic particles will interact with this two-phase material and a bond will form, resulting into formation of a composite. Okay, and this property of a material, if you process a metal through a route like this, you basically break down the dendritic structure and you can expect an equiaxed microstructure in the solidified material. If you do this stirring in the two-phase region, okay, so this microstructure can be even preserved even when you heat the material and melt it. Okay, so that property of a material to preserve that equiaxed microstructure even during remelting is known as thixotropy. Right, so thixotropy is nothing but having an equiaxed kind of microstructure rather than a dendritic microstructure, and that equiaxed microstructure can be preserved even while remelting the material. So once this thixotropic microstructure is formed in the material, you can have this non-dendritic or equiaxed microstructure every time you process this material. Okay. And riocasting is the process when you actually melt the material and then you bring it down to the two-state region and start stirring it. Okay, so that's the basic difference between riocasting and thixocasting. Essentially, both leads to a non-dendritic or equiaxed microstructure because of the fact that during the stirring, the dendrites are broken and equiaxed grains form. Okay, so when you add the particles during this stirring, you can make a composite material. So this is a two-phase process because the particles are added in the two-phase region of the matrix material. Okay, so we have solid state processing, liquid state processing, vapor state processing, and also two-phase processing. And in all of these cases, you can see that the particles are added externally. Okay, so this kind of composites, when the particles are added externally, are also known as Insitu composite, which indicates that particles are added externally. So here you need some means and ways to add these particles and incorporate them into the metal. Okay, one of the biggest challenges in such processes is to have these particles bonded to the metal. Okay, so that is one thing, whether the particle will be bonded or rejected. That is one issue that you have with such processes when particles are added externally. And the other problem is the fact that the particles can also agglomerate. The distribution of the particles may or may not be uniform, and this kind of agglomerated particles or clustered particles are not desirable because this kind of agglomeration will lead to deterioration of the properties. Okay, so therefore, you need to exercise a great deal of control in terms of controlling the process parameters to achieve a uniform distribution in these processes when the particles are added externally. Okay, so one way to overcome this is to have a process in which the particles can be generated within the matrix material without the need of adding them externally. So here the particles are generated in situ, and therefore such composites are known as in situ composites. But the question is, how do you generate these particles internally in the matrix material? Okay, so just like that, the particles cannot be generated. Here also, you will have to do something, if not adding them externally, in order to make these particles in situ during the processing itself. Okay, for example, if you want to have this kind of composite materials, aluminium based composite materials, where TiB2 particles are the reinforcement. But I do not want to add them externally to overcome all those issues that we talked about. Okay, so here, in order to generate these TiB2 particles internally in situ within the aluminium matrix, we will have to add something which will provide boron as well as titanium, and then during the processing, when titanium and boron combine, these TiB2 particles will form. Okay, so what is done here, you add some precursors of titanium and boron into the melt, and let them react to form these TiB2 particles. Okay, there could be many precursors which can be added, but the simplest and the most economical ones are the salts. This kind of salts such as KBF4. Okay, and for the titanium, you can have another salt which is K2TiF6. So these kind of compounds are quite cheap. They are not very expensive, and at the same time you get materials like boron and titanium, which are otherwise expensive if you want to buy them in elemental form. Okay, so if you could add these two in the correct proportion corresponding to the amount of TiB2 or the volume fraction of TiB2 which is needed, then this will release K2TiF6 will release titanium, and KBF4 will release boron, and then they will combine at the processing temperature to form TiB2 particles. And the reaction can be as follows. So first what is done is, here also it's basically a liquid metallurgy kind of route. Aluminium is melted, And then in the molten metal, these two salts are added in the required proportion according to the volume fraction of TiB2 which is needed in the final composite. Okay. So when you add these two into molten aluminium, then a reaction like this will take place. Right? So these byproducts that you have, they will go to the slag and these particles will go into the metal. Okay. So before pouring, you have to decant this top layer which contains these byproducts and remove it from the top of the molten metal, and after that you pour it, and as you solidify it will basically contain the TiB2 particles as the reinforcement. So you can see here that the TiB2 particles are generated in situ during the processing itself, and there is no need to add such particles externally. So what are the advantages you have in a process like this where you can generate the particles in situ? First of all, you can get a clear interface between the particles and the matrix. And this will also give rise to good properties. Because the interface between the particle and the matrix plays a significant role in many of the properties such as the strength. Okay. So if there is something forming at the interface and if that particular product is brittle in nature, then you can understand that the mechanical properties will suffer. And that can happen when you add such particles externally, because you are adding a separate material into the molten metal, and then you are allowing certain time for this bonding to take place between the particles and the metal. So during this time, there are chances of interfacial reactions. Okay, and those kind of reactions are not good because they will form some reaction product along the interface and will deteriorate the properties. Okay, but in this case, since these are forming in situ, these particles are forming in situ, there are no such possibility of forming interfacial reaction products. Then the bonding is also good. Because particles are growing in the metal itself. So therefore, the bonding between the particles and the matrix will be good, and this is again good for the properties. Okay. And apart from that, you can also generate fine particles. And finer the particles, higher will be the strength. Okay. So these are some of the advantages of in situ composites over the ex situ composites. In a similar manner, you can also make aluminium titanium carbide composites. Titanium carbide also is a very strong material. You would have noticed it when we talked about different kinds of reinforcements. Okay. So in order to generate titanium carbide, you need a source of titanium. So the same salt can be used, K2TiF6 for that. And you also need a source for carbon, for which graphite powder can be used. So you mix these two powders of K2TiF6 and graphite into the required proportion according to the amount of titanium carbide which is needed in the final composite, and then you add that mix into the molten aluminium. And as you do so, this will again lead to a reaction like what we had before for the aluminium titanium boride composite. And in this case, it is little different in the sense that the titanium carbide will not be formed directly like how you had in this case. Okay. So here, first you need to release the titanium from this salt, and since titanium has a high affinity for aluminium, it will first react with aluminium to form Al3Ti, and then from that Al3Ti the titanium will diffuse out and go to the graphite powder to react with it and form the titanium carbide. So the reaction could be as follows. First you have this ingredients added to the molten aluminium. So as I said, there will be first reaction between titanium and aluminium. So in the first step, titanium will be released from the K2TiF6 salt. This is step 1. Then the released titanium will react with aluminium to form Al3Ti. Okay. And then only when titanium is released from this Al3Ti, that means when Al3Ti dissolves and releases the titanium, then only it can react with carbon to form titanium carbide. So you can say the actual reaction to form the titanium carbide is between titanium and carbon in this case. Unlike the previous one, where the boron was released and it was directly reacting with titanium to form TiB2. Okay. So in order for you to have this Al3Ti releasing the titanium, the temperature and the time of processing have to be controlled. Okay. So unless and until the titanium is released from this Al3Ti, you won't get this TIC forming completely. Okay. And it is also desirable that you do not have the presence of Al3Ti and have only TIC particles, because Al3Ti is an intermetallic and this is a brittle material, so it will affect the mechanical properties, particularly the ductility. Okay. So the temperature and time of the reaction have to be controlled to make sure there is no Al3Ti and only TIC is forming. If you remember, we talked about similar kind of materials for grain refinement. We talked about aluminium, titanium, boron, and also aluminium, titanium, carbon. Okay. So this kind of grain refiners can also be made in similar manner. When you add a similar kind of raw materials, you can also make these master alloys. Okay, but the difference between the master alloys and the composite would be, in the composite you need only the reinforcement particles in the form of either TiC or TiB2. Whereas in case of the master alloys, you can also have the presence of the Al3Ti phase, and we have seen that that is the phase which is actually responsible for the grain refinement. Okay, but the processing is same. In the similar manner, this kind of master alloys can also be processed. All right, with that we come to the end of this lecture. Thank you for your attention.